for my voice, but I have never seen anything like it.
You believe in miracles? Yes! Unbelievable.
Welcome to the Andrew Zimmel podcast. I am your host, Andrew Zimmel. Before we start, I'm going to remind you one time that Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, YouTube, you can catch it anywhere and everywhere. So if you're not subscribed, if you haven't rated and reviewed us yet, you're missing out. Please do that for us. It'd be a big help. We have Jarrett Bailey coming on, talking about Eli Manning, who officially retires from the New York Football Giants. He is an enigma wrapped in a puzzle, I'll tell you that, Eli Manning. If you are a football fan, this is a great one for you. We break down essentially his entire career in 15 minutes, which very hard to do, but I think we went pretty in-depth with it. And if you're not a football fan, you're just an Eli Manning fan, congratulations, you picked one of the weirdest NFL quarterbacks to support. Jarrett Bailey, right here. All right, on the phone line right now, amateur NFL historian and the host of I'm Just Saying on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, Jarrett Bailey. Jarrett, what's up?
What's going on, buddy? Good. Glad to be on with you.
All right, yeah, no problem. Let's talk about probably the most polarizing quarterback that shouldn't be polarizing, Eli Manning. It doesn't make sense to me.
Eli's interesting, man. You know, he is famous, obviously, due to the fact that, you know, he is a part of the Manning family. I've always said that if, you know, his last name was Jones, we wouldn't care nearly as much about him. But the fact that he is a Manning and he played in the biggest media market in sports, I think that obviously added to his fame, his popularity. But, yeah, him announcing his retirement, something that I don't think that a lot of people saw coming. I thought he would go elsewhere for a year and try to give it one more run. But definitely a guy who came into the league, obviously in that famous 04 draft class with Rivers and Big Ben. He's going to be remembered as the guy who beat Brady twice in the Super Bowl. But to me, a guy who was an average talent, but for what he accomplished in the postseason is without a doubt going to be a Hall of Fame.
Yeah, let's start at the beginning of his career, because he gets drafted by the Chargers and kind of forces his way out of there. It's only probably the second time a quarterback who goes on to win 2 Super Bowls can do that, right? It's him and John Elway are probably the only 2 guys who force a trade out of the team that drafts them and ends up winning at the end. To me, that's the thing that's going to get the most overlooked about Eli, is that this is a guy who said, hey, I don't really want to play in San Diego. Send me to a more historic franchise. Send me to a place where I think I can win right away. And New York, I guess, was that place for him, right?
Yeah, and I think that that's something that, yeah, gets overlooked, but I think that a bigger deal was made out of it than what needed to be made out of it. Josh Rosen did the same thing a few years ago when he said that he wasn't particularly interested in going to Cleveland because of the, you know, history there. If you're a young quarterback and you see bright things in your future, you don't want to go to a franchise that has been in disarray. So I don't blame him for doing that to the betterment of his career. Obviously, things turned out really well for both him and Phillip Rivers. I got Phillip, a guy who I think should be a Hall of Famer. Don't know if he will be, but that's, you know, a different conversation for a different day. I think that that's something that gets overlooked, and I'm fine with it getting overlooked. It's fun to talk about because it's one of the more infamous draft day moments, you know, when he wouldn't hold up put on the Chargers hat. He didn't look too happy when he was drafted by San Diego. So it's definitely one of the more infamous draft moments. And then everything turns out okay when Phil gets traded for Eli. So it's definitely one of the more famous draft moments, but I think it getting overlooked isn't too much of a big deal, but definitely fun to talk about.
All right, well, let's talk about his first big playoff moments, right? Is when he goes and essentially he put the team on his back. It felt like to me, maybe I'm misremembering, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but that defense in 07 was really good. We all knew that the defense was really good, but when we got in the playoffs, it felt like Eli flipped on a switch that year and kind of took that team to a place that they weren't, I don't think a lot of people thought they were going to get to the Super Bowl. And I remember I was going back and actually rereading some of the articles that were going into that Super Bowl, and people thought it was going to be a 2 or 3 touchdown game in favor of the Patriots because they thought this is the best offense we've ever seen. Brady is slinging it. Randy Moss is great. What can we remember from that first Super Bowl and the Giants stopping perfection.
Well, yeah, you mentioned it. That front seven of the Giants was absolutely phenomenal. That's when Strahan was in his final years. Obviously, Euro was there. So they had a bunch of guys on that front seven that were just really good. And then in terms of the Giants themselves, they had a solid season. I mean, they went 10-6. They finished second in the NFC East. I believe they beat Philadelphia in the playoff run, the team who had won the division, in a somewhat convincing manner on the road. And then they go to Lambeau, one of the coldest games ever. Tom Coughlin's face looks like a tomato when the game's done. I mean, it was a freezing game. And he outdueled Brett Favre in Lambeau. And Eli just really came alive, and I think that was kind of his coming out party in terms of kind of letting the NFL know that he is legit. He's here. He's going to be here for a while. And then in the Super Bowl, yeah, I mean, you mentioned it. At the time, the 07 Patriots were the greatest offense, the greatest team the NFL's ever seen. And I think to this day, they're the best team that has ever played on the field. Yes, they didn't win the Super Bowl, but that's still, you look at all the records they set, Brady and Moss. I think that's still the best team that's ever been assembled. And some way, somehow, the Giants defense held the highest scoring offense in NFL history up to that point, to 14 points. They put pressure on Tom Brady. And that ultimately is what led to the Giants being able to, don't forget, the offense wasn't explosive for either side on that game. It was a low scoring Super Bowl. But obviously enough was done, especially in that final drive with the Tyree catch and then Plexico scoring the game winning touchdown. But I think that the biggest thing for them that year was their defense, and the edge rushers that they had, with, like I said, Strahan and Euro and Tuck. It was a very solid defense with really good pass rushers, a solid secondary, and Eli did enough to help them win, especially on that final drive. But I think the defense is what really carried them in that game.
I think that's going to be the thing, and we're going to talk about the 2012 championship in a second, but I think that's going to be the thing that when voters pick, and vote for him, because I think he's going to end up in the Hall of Fame. I don't know if he'll be a first-round ballot type of guy to get in, but I think he'll get in. I think that's what we're going to look at is like, oh, that defense kind of carried him. And I don't know. I don't think that you can have it both ways. I don't think that you can say the quarterback is the most important position on the field, and without it, you're not going to win a lot of games. And at the same time say, well, Eli doesn't deserve that Super Bowl ring or that praise for that Super Bowl because the defense carried him.
No, and yeah, obviously Eli played well in that Super Bowl, but you look at his regular season stats, they were nothing to drool over. He threw 20 interceptions that year, only completed 56% of his passes, a little bit over 3,300 total yards. So it wasn't anything spectacular by any means, but this is, a good running team that year. Offensively, they were I would say, more of a run team. Brandon Jacobs was a 1,000-yard rusher. Derek Ward had a solid year. Reuben Drones had a solid year as a third guy. In terms of the rush game. So they were a better rush team than they were a pass team. And I think that's kind of what they relied on. I would say almost like Buffalo does now with Josh Allen. I think they're very more run-centric, not trying to compare Eli to Josh Allen because obviously they're far different quarterbacks. But I think they were just trying to make it where they could give the ball to different playmakers and just try to have Eli be a game manager in that sense. And he did turn the ball over a lot that year. And I think that a lot of that's justified in what they wanted to do when you have a quarterback who throws 20 interceptions. But through that playoff run, he looked like a completely different guy than he was in the regular season. And he was a big part of the reason that they won that Super Bowl, especially in his postseason run. Like I said, being able to outduel Favre and Lambeau and then going in and having that game-winning drive in the Super Bowl. So, yeah, I don't know who's saying that Eli doesn't deserve that Super Bowl because the defense was so good, because without Eli making the plays that he did, they wouldn't have gotten that ring.
And that's exactly where I'm thinking. So fast forward to 2010, and it's been 3 years since they won the Super Bowl. I think a lot of people were selling their Eli Manning stock. I think people in New York were starting to get a little bit restless about Eli Manning. 2 seasons later, they're back on top. That gap between the 2 Super Bowls, what are we going to remember from that?
I think a lot of chaos, because there was a period where, I think around 2010, 2011, there was a lot of Giants fans saying, hey, maybe we should try to find a new quarterback. And I don't think that's necessarily fair. I think, especially in that New York media market, it's New York. You're going to get when, you're playing in New York. But, they were just 3 years removed from the Super Bowl in 2010. They had just gone 10-6 again in 2010, so it's not like they were terrible. And I think it was just a lot of recklessness building off of, the Super Bowl that they had won just a few years ago. So I think that a lot of that was kind of unfair. And Eli, he played well that year, besides the turnovers again. I mean, he threw for 4,000 yards, but he also threw 25 interceptions. And that was why I think a lot of fans are saying, look, he's a turnover machine. Another year of 20-plus interceptions. This isn't how we're going to win games. But they were a 10-win team despite that. I think that a lot of that can be compared to maybe Jameis Winston nowadays, where the team had a lot of talent, but were being held back by the turnovers by Eli. So I think once 2012 rolled around, again, they were the wild card team. They weren't giving much of a chance to win. And again, they go in on another playoff run, and they shock the world again, beating New England in the Super Bowl. So I think that going into that for Eli, that was, I think, kind of a redemption type thing from the past couple of years, especially the 25 interception year. They beat the 49ers in the NFC title game, one of the more exciting games of recent memory. So I think that a lot of that had to do with, at least for Eli, I think that was, trying to prove to fans like, hey, I am still the guy. I can still get this done. And, we're a team that can still win a Super Bowl. And Eli had a good year that year. They had 12 wins when the season was all said and done. They went 9-7 that year. They snuck into the playoffs and then had a win out. So I think that, when they finished, 9-7, no one really gave them a shot. They probably thought they're going to be a one and done, and then they just go on this incredible run once again. Eli just turned into a different animal in the playoffs again.
Can we call Eli Manning one of the biggest it's like almost one of the biggest like boom or bust quarterbacks? And I don't think he'll be remembered as that, but I think like it's true that like when he was hot, nobody could touch him, and when it was cold, it was a 30 interception season almost.
Yes. I mean, you look at his career stats, man. I mean, you go back to that 2010 year where he went 31 touchdowns, 25 picks. 2011, it's 29 touchdowns, 16 picks. 2012, 26 and 15. And then 2013, the year after they win the Super Bowl, 18 touchdowns to 27 interceptions with a rating of 69.4. I think that at that point, that's where fans started kind of picking that up again, where really 27 interceptions, we can't keep doing this. And then he rebounds again. So I think Boomer Bust is definitely, that's the way I would describe him. Because in 2014 and 2015, he had back-to-back years of 30-plus touchdown passes, and things seem to be looking up for him. So I think that in that regard, Boomer Bust isn't a horrible way to describe him, but when you have a guy who's thrown 20 interceptions 3 times in his career, that is something that I think is a fair label.
Well, you mentioned earlier, you said that if this guy's name was anything else, that we wouldn't hold him in the same type of conversations. Like, he would have his own narrative. That would be the only thing. Peyton Manning, one of the most consistent quarterbacks, week in and week out, season after season. There's about the beginning of his career and the end of his career are the only 2 times where he was different, and that is youth and age. Eli is a completely different animal. He reminds me, it's funny, because Archie Manning played for the Saints. You could say that he has more, Eli's more similar to Archie than he is to Peyton, I think. Is that fair?
I think that's fair, and I think it's pretty ironic the fact that Peyton is regarded as the greatest regular season quarterback of all time, but was known to struggle in the postseason, where Eli was kind of a guy who we didn't know what we were going to get in the regular season, and then when postseason time came, he lit it up and did really well, obviously, with the 2 Super Bowl runs. So I think that's pretty ironic in that sense, where we hold Peyton to this ginormous standard because of all the things that he's done in the regular season, all the records that he broke during the regular season. But a guy who, for a long time before he finally won his first Super Bowl, was regarded as a guy who couldn't get the job done.
Yeah. Is there another quarterback? Could there be, and I don't mean this to be like rude to Eli, but could there be a worse quarterback to be the bane of Tom Brady's existence, where this is the only guy to beat Tom Brady 2 times in the Super Bowl? I think Nick Foles might be the only quarterback who is less talented than Eli Manning that ended up beating Tom. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's definitely fair. And Nick Foles, I think for the Eagles, that was just a perfect storm, because the way that Frank Reich ran that offense with Nick Foles, the way that Doug Peterson just said, really simplified the game plan to where Nick Foles liked it. I think that was just a perfect storm for Philadelphia going into that postseason. I don't think anybody expected Nick Foles to come out and lead Philly to a Super Bowl, but ultimately we know what happened. In terms of worst quarterbacks, yeah, I think that Nick Foles is the only one that you can really look at that's been a thorn in the side of Brady and Belichick. I think that maybe Chad Pennington, I think he had a few wins as a Jet over them. No disrespect to Chad Pennington, but I don't think he's as talented as Eli Manning is. So it's not that Eli isn't talented, because obviously he's going to be a Hall of Famer. He's got 2 Super Bowl rings. But if we take away the Super Bowl rings, which I know that's a big thing to do, but if we just look at Eli's regular season stats for his career, he's a 500 guy in terms of win-loss record. He's had very average stats. Obviously, a lot of touchdown passes, but in today's game, I think that's kind of inflated. But you look at the turnovers, it's problematic. So I think that I'll go back to the Jameis Winston reference. I think that Jameis is kind of a modern-day Eli, but more of a gunslinger than Eli was. I think that, especially the offense that Jameis is in, where they do nothing but pass, I think that definitely inflates his stats a little bit as well. But I think that Jameis is a guy who we can kind of compare to Eli in that sense, where he's very boom or bust. So if I had to make like a today comparison for Eli, I think he'd be a little bit of Jameis Winston and Nick Foles kind of wrapped up into one.
5 years from now, what are we going to remember from the almost 20 years we had of Eli Manning?
I think we're going to remember the fact that he was the one in 18-1. We're going to remember the fact that he beat Tom Brady twice in the Super Bowl. I don't think a lot of people are going to talk about the 27 interceptions, the 25 interceptions. They're not going to talk about, any of, those outliers. We're going to talk about the Iron Man streak, the consecutive games started. We're going to talk about a guy who New York loves. And even though around that 2010 to 2013 stretch, where there were times where they were saying they might want a new quarterback, when he was benched by Ben McAdoo for Geno Smith, all the uproar that came with that, I think the city showed how much they truly do love Eli Manning, and wanted to see him go out as a Giant. And I think that that's the thing that they're going to remember the most, is the fact that through all the ups and downs, all the losing seasons, all the turnovers, he's still a guy who has 2 Super Bowl rings, brought 2 Super Bowls to that team, but to that city. And I think he's always going to be heralded as a New York legend because of that. I don't think they're going to talk about any negatives when they bring up Eli Manning's name. They're going to talk about a guy who was tough as they come, and won 2 Super Bowls for that team, and 2 of the most, I would say, upset victories in Super Bowl history. So I think that's what, especially New York's going to remember Eli Manning for, is a tough guy who brought the city 2 Super Bowls.
Also, he's the best quarterback in Giants history at this point. Like, I think that he's
surpassed 100%.
Surpassed everybody. Is he? I think he's on the Mount Rushmore too of the 21st century New York athletes. Like, I think it's him, Jeter, Jeremy Lin, and I don't know. You could fill in the next guy.
You put Jeremy Lin on the Mount Rushmore in New York.
I mean, it's fair.
I think
his peak's higher.
Yeah, that's the thing, though. I think if we're doing just Mount Rushmore, one sport per athlete, I think that Eli is definitely the one for the Giants of the 21st century. You put Jeter there for the Yankees. But in terms of Knicks, yeah, you've got a solid point. I think that Melo would be over Jeremy Lin. I think that his run with the Knicks, where they were solid for a few years, went to the playoffs for a few years, I think that Melo would be put above Jeremy Lin. But yeah, I could see why some people put Lin's sanity up on that Mount Rushmore.
Yeah, and David Wright, we'll put him up for the Mets.
Yeah, that's fair, yeah.
All right, hey, give the guys one more chance, give them one more chance to follow you on Twitter and find your content.
Yeah, so hit me up on Twitter, Jarrett_Bailey4. That's JARRETT_Bailey4. You can find me on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio. I'm Just Saying with Jarrett Bailey. Also, the NFL on Rap podcast, myself and Kurt Homiser do a couple podcasts a week talking nothing but NFL. So a lot of fun stuff that I'm doing right now. You can check me out on Overtime Heroics. I'll be dropping a piece within the week or so, what each NFL team should do in the offseason, what their top priorities should be. So a lot of stuff coming from me. You can check it all out. I'll tweet about it, and you'll be able to find everything that I'm doing through Twitter.
All right, it's Jarrett Bailey. Thanks so much for coming on, man.
All right, man. Thanks. Take care.
That's going to do it for the show. Thank you for Jarrett for jumping on the podcast with me. Thank you for everybody who's continued to give us support as we got this thing going. We've done a week of these podcasts. This is the first official week of the Andrew Zimmel podcast, and I thought it went pretty well. We had over 100 unique streams in the first week. So hopefully that number will continue to grow as you guys continue to listen to the podcast. That's not including Apple Podcast or Google Podcasts, which we only jumped on board with recently. So hopefully those numbers will continue to grow, and it can only happen with listeners like you. So thank you. Please continue to send us your content. Continue to send us takes. We'd love to hear those. And we have an open phone line policy. So if you want to come on the show, if you have a hot take on movies or pop culture or TV or sports, let me know. You can come on the show and you can argue with me about it. It's an open invitation to anybody and everybody. So thank you for listening. Love you guys. I'll see you around.